The 1980s, a time when the synthesizers were hot, the phones were massive, and a wannabe blockbuster seemed to roll off the Hollywood production line almost every weekend. Some lit up the box office, but others, not so much. Whether due to marketing missteps, creative miscalculations, or just being too weird for their time, many crashed and burned in cinemas. If they were bold enough, strange enough, or just plain unforgettable though, they refused to disappear. Today we're diving into 4 of the most ambitious, unique and gloriously bizarre almost blockbusters of the decade. Dark fantasies, interdimensional chaos, brave sequels to nowhere, and all sadly total box office busts. So slap on some neon, pour a Campari and soda, fire up your oscillation overthruster, and remember, it's all in the reflexes. This is Lost Blockbusters of the 1980s, the sequel, when Hollywood got weird. Welcome to the show. Here at Culture Slice Towers, we've spent a fair amount of time in the 1990s this year, and sure, the 90s was a glorious time, both for pop culture and teenage culture slice. But there's just something about the 1980s, isn't there? The aesthetic, the music, the vibe, the linen suits. Then of course there were the movies. And if there's one thing Hollywood couldn't resist in the 80s, it was a sequel. So today, Lost Blockbusters of the 1980s gets its very own second installment. That's right, it's time for Lost Blockbusters of the 80s 2, Electric Boogaloo. Sorry, got a bit carried away there. Moving on, in this sequel we're heading into the stranger corners of the decade, a time when brave, wild, genre-mashing visions managed to make it through the studio system. And we're kicking things off with a trip back to 1985 for an ambitious fantasy epic from a visionary director with a cast led by a megastar in waiting. This movie had blockbuster written all over it. Or did it? Many of the most admired movies in Hollywood history were not hits when they first arrived in cinemas. Citizen Kane may be labelled the best movie ever made now, but it was a commercial letdown in 1941. It's a Wonderful Life, perhaps the most famous Christmas film of all time, barely scraped back its production budget in 1946. Back in 1939, The Wizard of Oz struggled to break even during its initial run, but more on the Emerald City later. In 1982, a truly iconic sci-fi movie, Blade Runner, suffered a similar fate, significantly under-delivering at the box office the first time round, before becoming an all-time classic in hindsight. When Blade Runner stalled in cinemas, its director, Ridley Scott, still had enough momentum from the success of Alien, which made $188 million in 1979, to bring a passion project he had first conceived years prior to the big screen. And it's a film that would end up suffering a fate closer to Blade Runner than Alien. Scott had long wanted to bring a fairy tale to the screen, a film he could make for his young kids. Although the movie he ended up creating veered to much darker territory in the end. Drawing inspiration from Beauty and the Beast, the works of the Brothers Grimm and more, he concluded that it needed to be brand new as it was far easier to design a story to fit the medium of cinema than bend the medium for an established story. Scott worked on that story with writer William Hortzberg before shooting Blade Runner under the absolutely awesome title of Legend of Darkness. Taking the project to Disney, the obvious home for a brand new fairy tale given its history, Scott was quickly rejected. We were years away from the Disney Renaissance here, and even though they were cooking up their own jet black fantasy animation for 1985, Disney weren't interested. Legend of Darkness was odd, too much of a gothic fever dream, and they passed on the project. By the time Blade Runner had wrapped, The script was lengthy, hugely expensive, and impractical in its size and scope, but they eventually chopped Legend down to something a little more manageable. Still though, no studio was biting. Thankfully, businessman turned producer Arnold Milchan appreciated Scott's vision and agreed to finance the $25 million project, a fairly large risk for a producer who, when Legend went into production, had only one released film on his resume, Martin Scorsese's King of Comedy, which got great reviews but made essentially no money in 1982. This was a huge leap of faith, but he felt Scott was clearly a director worth having faith in. He sold domestic distribution rights to Universal and international to 20th Century Fox. The studios wouldn't have much say during production, but might well do once they saw the finished film. Which, yeah, they did. Anyway. The story of Legend was just your standard, everyday tale of a Lord of Darkness planning to create eternal night by destroying the last of the world's unicorns and marrying a princess, with only a young forest-dwelling Tom Cruise and his friends having any hope of saving the princess and their entire world. As you do. Wait, Tom Cruise? That's right, Tom Cruise played the role of Jack, the pure-hearted hero. Even if his performances in The Outsiders and Risky Business had created some momentum for his career, he was far from a blockbuster headliner at this stage, but Scott felt he was perfect for the film. Then unknown Mia Sara instantly became his clear choice for Princess Lily during a casting session. Casting the part of Darkness, the genuinely quite freaky demon antagonist, proved slightly more complex. Who could play what essentially amounted to a depiction of Satan? In the end, he discovered his darkness almost by chance. While considering Richard O'Brien for another role, he watched the Rocky Horror Picture Show and realized without a doubt that Tim Curry could pull off the role. He was right. With an entire Legend world to create, full forest sets were lavishly created at Pinewood Studios over a 14-week period. The costuming was intricate and complex. Curry's makeup to become Darkness took 5 hours or more to apply every day. Very few corners were cut, and there was no doubt that Legend would look great. It would also unquestionably be strange without the usual Hollywood studio filter. It would cover subjects like death and temptation, and was seemingly constantly on the verge of breaking out into a full-blown horror movie. I mean, within the first act there was a unicorn scalping scene, which was instantly up there with Atreyu's horse Artax drowning in the swamp of sadness as being one of the most disturbing horse-based scenes of the 1980s. It only got creepier from there, and let's not get started about Darkness being turned into a sort of horny sex symbol. Horny? Get it? Anyway, Legend went in front of the cameras in late March 1984, a shoot which lasted until the end of summer, with further reshoots in early 1985. The process was beset with problems. Scott's look for the film of a fairy tale on acid meant that lighting and rigging sometimes took hours between shots. The requirements for the elaborate sets, costumes and makeup caused yet further delays. A huge fire broke out on the Pinewood set, leaving considerable damage and more headaches for the crew. Cruise and Sara in particular were inexperienced. He'd never been in a film of this scale before, and she'd never even been in a film before. But they got it done. After an exhausting process of almost 2 years of active production, by early summer 1985, the final film was ready. The only problem was, test screenings in the US went badly. Like, really badly. Audiences found the film slow, confusing, and too dark. Quite literally in some cases. And Universal Pictures panicked. They delayed the North American release until 1986, agreed with Scott to cut the film down, make numerous changes, and replace Jerry Goldsmith's orchestral score with a soundtrack from electronic group Tangerine Dream instead. As Scott remembers, I got totally paranoid. I started to hack away at the movie. On reflection, it was the wrong thing to do. So in the end, the version American audiences saw was shorter, with dialogue and establishing shots removed to speed up the plot a bit, and a crawl opening added which explained the story in clear details. So the version of Legend, released 9 months later in the States, had a shorter running time and a completely different score. Still with me? Perfect. Either way, it didn't help. Critics were nonplussed and vitriolic at times. The Washington Post noted that Legend may turn out to be legendary, but not in the way the filmmakers intended. And TV Guide said that ultimately Legend is done in by the director's ambition. Gene Siskel delivered the most brutal blow. It stinks from top to bottom. Roger Ebert didn't dislike it quite as much, but was still far from glowing. All of the special effects in the world, and all of the great makeup, and all of the great Muppet creatures can't save a movie that has no clear idea of its own mission and no joy in its own accomplishment. It was not a rousing reception. When Legend finally debuted in North America on April 18, 1986, it grabbed top spot and held it for 2 weeks. But this wasn't exactly peak season, and it dropped out of the top 10 after just one more week. The film managed a little over $15 million in the US and Canada, having made $8 million internationally for a total box office gross of $23.5 million, less than the production budget, and that's before taking into account marketing and other costs. And yet, though Legend absolutely did not become a blockbuster, it also refused to vanish into the night. Over the years, it built a following, and in 2002, Scott released a director's cut that restored Goldsmith's score, added 20 minutes to the runtime, improved the pacing, and generally made the whole thing feel more like the fantasy epic he'd originally intended. It didn't rewrite history, but it did earn Legend some appreciation, just a couple of decades too late. As is so often the case, good timing is almost everything, and Legend had none of it. Not only was it released in North America as the Hollywood trend for fantasy films was nosediving, but its US release came the month before Top Gun hit cinemas and made Cruise an A-lister almost overnight. A month after Top Gun came Ferris Bueller's Day Off, a movie which would establish Mia Sara as a face to watch in Hollywood. Would releasing Legend later have made a huge difference? It's impossible to know for sure, but a post-Top Gun Cruise, coming off the highest grossing film of 1986, would have been a far bigger draw. Without his star power behind it though, this would become something of a strange footnote in both Cruise and Scott's careers. It's a shame that it's ended up in that position really. Legend is such a visual masterpiece where every penny of the budget and every hour of the crew's hard work is up on the screen. It's certainly flawed, but it's also inventive, very strange and beautiful at times. Tim Curry steals the show as darkness for as long as he's on the screen. The plot feels flimsy, even for a fairy tale, but the fact that it feels more like art house expression than a major studio release gives it a unique point of interest. However I describe it 40 years on though, the fact is that it did not connect at the time. Perhaps tellingly, Ridley Scott wouldn't make another fantasy film. Maybe I did a fantasy too soon, he would later reflect. I'm glad Legend exists though. It remains a curious entry in 80s cinema and the film which helped to shut the book on Hollywood's brief obsession with the fantasy genre in the 1980s. Any film that fully commits like Legend does, horns, hooves, glitter and all, deserves to not be shrouded in darkness forevermore. Once long ago, in a time before homepages and algorithms, the watchers of tales sought a place to feed their curious minds, and a video to put on whilst eating their dinner. From across the realms came two portals of knowledge, nostalgia, and the occasional Tom Selleck reference. A noble knight known as Culture Slice, and their trusty sidekick Culture Slice Cuts. Those who subscribed were granted the power to revisit the past and make sense of forgotten futures. Those who didn't, were not. Choose wisely, traveller. Subscribe to the channels and click the bell, or else the shadows could steal Culture Slice from your feed forevermore. Next up tonight comes a film from arguably the greatest cult director of all time, as he stepped onto the blockbuster battlefield to make a major summer movie for one of the big Hollywood studios, but ended up in big trouble of his own. So why didn't this unforgettable kung fu fantasy action comedy make it to the pillars of heaven in 1986? Well, sit back, hold tight and keep the home fires burning. And if we're not back by dawn, call the president. It always fascinates me when a director unexpectedly gets the keys to the Hollywood studio system. When a filmmaker who made their name redefining genres on the fringes suddenly steps into the Hollywood machine, tasked with navigating a major release outside of their comfort zone with a big budget and a marketing plan which probably includes suggestions for Happy Meal toys. In 1986, that director was John Carpenter. After years of turning low-budget horror and sci-fi into cinematic gold and delivering big profits with independent studios, Carpenter was handed the chance to make a summer blockbuster. And the film he made was a supernatural kung fu comedy that mashed together ancient Chinese mythology, Indiana Jones-style adventure, and a truck driver who clearly has no idea he's not the hero. It completely befuddled 20th Century Fox, the studio backing it. As Carpenter reflected years later, I was hoping that the movie would be successful and would lead to more big-budget films, but it wasn't, and that's the reality of the business. You're only as good as your last picture. The thing is, Carpenter's last pictures before 1986 had been pretty good. After Halloween had redefined horror movies in the late 70s and The Fog continued his run of hits in 1980, Carpenter had turned the $6 million budget of Escape from New York into a $50 million box office return in 1981. All had been released by independent studios and all had made many multiples of their production costs. A year later though, The Thing had been released by Universal and flopped with audiences and critics alike. It's now rightly seen as a classic, but it had been a notable setback at the time. The Thing's failure saw him replaced as director on the Stephen King adaptation Firestarter and lose his development deal with Universal, but Carpenter rebounded somewhat in the preceding years. Keen to move away from making cult movies, he would eventually end up helming 1984's Starman after numerous others dropped out. It had been in development for years, with him coming on board to deliver a film that didn't pull up too many trees at the box office, but did offer a different, sweeter, even romantic vision to the director's CV. By 1985, he was ready to be hired for his next project, a job he specifically took as a chance to make a big studio picture. Big Trouble in Little China originated from a script by Gary Goldman and David Weinstein, who had left the project when Fox wanted the story to be switched to a more modern setting to give it a better chance of box office success. Enter W.D. Richter. Remember that name? He'll be back later in this video. Who retooled the script, added more comedy and Chinese mysticism, and even turned down the chance to direct The Thing, having been put off by his studio experience making a movie we'll be discussing later. So Fox needed a director, and they saw Carpenter as the ideal option. He eventually agreed, made his own tweaks to the script, and Big Trouble in Little China went into production in the summer of '85. The shooting script they ended up with told the story of Kurt Russell's Jack Burton, a brash but clueless truck driver, and his friend Dennis Dunn's Wang Chi, who enter the San Francisco Chinatown underworld when Wang's fiancée is kidnapped by the ancient sorcerer Lo Pan. Along the way on their rescue mission, they encounter armies, kung fu masters, Kim Cattrall as Jack's love interest, and uncover an ancient curse that Lo Pan is attempting to break. As chaos unfolds, Jack stumbles through a world of mysticism, mayhem, and martial arts, rarely understanding what's going on, almost always being saved by someone else, but usually ready with a one-liner. From the beginning though, there were signs for concern. Fox were worried about competition from Eddie Murphy's The Golden Child, which went into production at a similar time and also covered comedy, Chinese spiritualism, and martial arts. So they wanted Big Trouble released, by the summer of '86 to avoid going head-to-head. The thinking was logical. Murphy was one of the biggest movie stars in the world by this stage, and the two films had similarities, but it meant Carpenter had a fast turnaround in pre-production to make an October '85 filming date, and then less than 4 months to shoot the thing. A big ask for a movie with so many stunts, fight scenes, special effects, and intricate sets. The whole production team felt the pressure. We had no time. The studio said, we've got to beat The Golden Child to theatres. That was the whole idea, get it done and out. Fox didn't really understand what they were backing either. They wanted a standard action picture, while Carpenter was shooting an action comedy with lots of irony, where the hero is in fact almost completely useless. The director has said the studio was scared of the movie, and that fear extended into the editing process. Fox execs micromanaged the work, requested a new opening scene be added to make Jack Burton seem more heroic, and the timelines for ILM to deliver effects were brutal. When it came to the marketing, the studio misrepresented Carpenter's satirical vision. They sold it as a more traditional 80s action movie, Rambo in Chinatown as Carpenter would later call it. That's if they did really sell it at all. Big Trouble's promotional budget of around $3 million was small for a major release film at the time. So when it rolled out to cinemas on July 2nd, 1986, those audiences who did know about it didn't get what they were expecting. Big Trouble never even made it into the box office top 10 across its entire cinema run. Debuting behind fellow newcomers Psycho 3, Basil the Great Mouse Detective, About Last Night, and Under the Cherry Moon on opening weekend, and failing to build any momentum from there. Hung out to dry by its lack of effective promotion, North American box office takings of just over $11 million didn't come close to its $25 million production budget, and saw Big Trouble labelled as a flop. Critical responses were all over the place at the time, ranging from a dull film, an artless dig in the Spielberg garden in the Chicago Tribune, to Harlan Ellison's take that it was a cheerfully blathering live-action cartoon that will give you release from the real pressures of your basically dreary lives. But its legend has grown over time. Finding a new life on the small screen, it remains a classic to this day, but it never became the genuinely different blockbuster it deserved to be. Given the time constraints and studio pressure, the film Carpenter managed to deliver is really shockingly good. Big Trouble finds the perfect balance of action, comedy, and batshit crazy. It subverts the genre, creates something genuinely fresh, and does it without fear of being completely odd along the way. It also features one of the finest theme songs in 80s cinema, from Carpenter's own band the Coupe de Villes. The music video alone was worth the production budget of the entire movie. Though the film itself holds up to this day, is really funny and looks great too, the production and release left scars for those involved, not least the director himself. After Big Trouble, I lost my taste for the big studios. I thought we had something special. It had martial arts, fantasy, humor, but the studio didn't know what to do with it. It was frustrating. I think I realized then that I'm not cut out for the politics of the big studios. Navigating Hollywood's system takes crackerjack timing for sure, but maybe John Carpenter was always destined to be a lone wolf. As for the fate of the Golden Child, well, that's a story for another day. Take us away, Big Trouble in Little China. What happens when a first-time director with a clear vision is handed the keys to the Emerald City? In our penultimate film tonight, we're heading back to 1985, when one of Hollywood's greatest editors teamed up with a producer riding high off the success of, Police Academy? As Disney looked to reinvigorate a true Hollywood classic with a bold, darker take for a new generation. What followed was a chaotic production and an even messier release, a true one-off attempt to steer the family blockbuster in a freaky, fascinating new direction, and nightmare fuel for a generation of kids. For better or for worse, we're not in Kansas anymore. There were some unexpected trends in the 1980s. Shoulder pads the size of your garage, riots over Cabbage Patch Kids dolls, the obsession with getting busy with the fizzy by owning a SodaStream machine. But perhaps the most surprising was the Hollywood urge for making follow-ups to iconic films decades after the originals. Usually involving none of the first film's creative team, these sequels were a kind of low-tech IP mining, many years ahead of the current Hollywood playbook. We're used to pretty much everything getting rebooted now, but back in the mid-80s, studios taking this route was a bit of a shock. So these creative experiments were far higher risk and usually met with complete confusion. 1983 saw Psycho 2 pick up Hitchcock's masterpiece more than 2 decades later. In 1984, 2010, the year we make contact, took the ballsy approach of following on from the story of Stanley Kubrick's 2001 A Space Odyssey. These weren't legacy sequels, they were rolls of the dice for the studios involved. And for that, honestly, even though many criticized or prejudged them at the time, I think they have to be commended in some senses. The most high profile of these experiments came in 1985 in the form of Return to Oz, a standalone follow-up to 1939's The Wizard of Oz, one of the most beloved films in Hollywood history. The Wizard of Oz had become a cultural institution, repeated endlessly on TV since the 1950s and absorbed into the DNA of pop culture. Most saw it as untouchable. Other interpretations of the story had been made, and attempts at a sequel had been floated before, but never came to fruition over concerns of tarnishing the original's legacy. In Hollywood, imagine that. But with L. Frank Baum's many Oz books to use as source material, there was the potential to cover a lot more ground. That and the fact that, by 1980, the rights that Disney held on making an Oz movie from the later stories were about to expire. So when Disney exec Tom Wilhite asked Walter Murch what he might be interested in making his directorial debut, his answer, another Wizard of Oz movie from the later books in the series, couldn't have come at a better time. Murch was a major creative force already. He'd worked on American Graffiti, the Godfather films, and had just won an Academy Award for his work on Apocalypse Now. His editing and sound design was trusted implicitly by George Lucas and Francis Ford Coppola. But even with that pedigree, following up The Wizard of Oz was a massive gamble, especially when his vision was so starkly different to the MGM classic fans knew so well. This was Murch's dream project though. We knew going in that it was going to be risky, but it had been 45 years since the original. I thought enough time had passed for a different sensibility to have a chance. Murch's script, co-written by Gil Dennis, picked up 6 months after The Wizard of Oz. Young Dorothy, played by Fairuza Balk in her very first film role, is declared insane for talking about life in Oz and sent to a Kansas mental institution. But when a storm hits, she escapes, nearly drowns, and wakes up in Oz for the second time. Only, this Oz is nothing like the one she remembers. The Emerald City is in ruins, the yellow brick road has been torn apart, and there are crazy, evil, nightmare-inducing villains like the Wheelers hunting her down. The no longer magical kingdom is now ruled by the Gnome King and an evil princess who casually swaps out heads for fun. With the help of her strange new allies, Tick-Tock, Jack Pumpkinhead, a flying sofa called the Gump, and Bellina the talking chicken, Dorothy sets off to the Gnome King's mountain to restore Oz to its former glories. Bleak, surreal, and rooted in the darker elements of the Oz books, dealing with themes like abandonment, loss, and the descent into madness, this was 100% not going to be your average 80s family movie. There were no show tunes, and the usual Hollywood positivity filter was well and truly turned off. As Return to Oz went into active production though, Disney's own Magic Kingdom was on entirely shaky ground. The studio was in chaos. Their first original animated film in years, The Black Cauldron, was spiraling out of control, and would almost end up shutting their animation division down for good. Live-action films like The Black Hole were failures, and soon the likes of Condor Man would follow suit. Tron was amazing and groundbreaking in 1982, obviously, but it was also expensive and extremely time-consuming to produce. Being expensive and time-consuming were soon two things Tron and Return to Oz would have in common. When principal photography began in early 1984, it soon became clear just how huge the task of bringing the new Oz film to the screen would be. Though Murch felt that advances in special effects could make the project a reality, he perhaps didn't quite account for the sheer scale of the movie. Combining working with kids, animals, puppets, animatronics, shooting for claymation which would be done in post-production, CGI, and all for your directorial debut, it was a lot for anyone. The shoot quickly fell behind schedule, budget issues increased, and Disney execs, picking up a project their predecessors had approved, hated the early footage they were seeing from the production going on in England. 5 weeks in, they fired Murch. Enter George Lucas. Mr. Star Wars flew to England, convinced Disney to reinstate Murch, and even guaranteed that he would step in and finish the thing if Murch couldn't. As Murch remembers, it was a fantastic act of generosity and commitment on his part. He used some kind of Jedi mind trick to convince them to rehire me. The film had also been given a new producer. Gary Kurtz, who had started the project, had clashed with Disney on the budget and departed for an executive position not long after. But he was soon replaced by a new man, the man who was there to save the day, the man who brought us Police Academy. Even though he would become the driving force behind endless Police Academy sequels, Paul Maslansky wasn't primarily known as the producer behind the adventures of Mahoney, Lassard and Friends in early 1984. Prior to Police Academy 1's April release in that year, he'd made his name as the producer of the Oscar-nominated drama The Right Stuff. So while a jump from Police Academy to Return to Oz might not make perfect sense in hindsight, at the time he was seen as the man who could help steer the troubled production to completion. Post-production was grueling, even for a master editor like Murch, and early test screenings went poorly. Murch remembers this having both negative and positive implications. There was a whole new management at Disney, and they were not really interested in Return to Oz, so they mostly ignored it after it did not do so well in previews, which was both good and bad. The good part was that I was able to complete the film I wanted to make. The bad part was that they didn't really get behind its release. With Disney unimpressed, the reaction of critics didn't help matters. Though most praised the visuals, world building, and the performance of Bulk, it was mostly met with confusion. The San Francisco Chronicle called it a mechanical movie that never finds a real heart to engage an audience, while TV Guide noted it doesn't have any wit, joy, or drive. A view Time expanded upon by stating that it would defy the gifts of an Olivier to find interesting, amusing life in a context as charmless and joyless and songless as the one Murch and his design team have concocted. Siskel and Ebert didn't like it much either.
Now here's a film that really blew its potential to entertain. The sequel to the classic Wizard of Oz called Return to Oz. First of all, they didn't make it a musical. Not smart. You know, it's a bad film when the chicken is the most interesting character in the picture. And actually, the chicken was kind of cute in this film.
It seemed like the world was not ready for another Oz movie, and it could not be saved at the box office. Landing in cinemas on June 21st, 1985, Return to Oz was a financial washout. It hit 7th spot on opening week, behind the likes of Cocoon, Rambo First Blood Part 2, Fletch and The Goonies. So it was a pretty strong week, but still an underperformance, and Return to Oz's journey didn't get any less bumpy from there. It would only stay in the top 10 for one more week and slid out of cinemas quietly after only a few more. In the summer of '85, Back to the Future was the kind of movie audiences wanted to see, rather than a sequel to a film from 50 years ago that seemed to be too scary for kids and too old-fashioned for teenagers. Perception is everything, and the optics weren't great. In the end, Return to Oz generated $11 million domestically against its $28 million production budget, having been labelled a disaster from day one. Return to Oz is one of the bleakest family films of this or any era, relentlessly, unapologetically so, from the very beginning. I mean, the movie starts with a child escaping electrotherapy treatment at a sanatorium and just goes downhill from there. The original Oz movie had darker elements, but also a light and shade and musical numbers that allowed it to be presented as easily digestible family entertainment. Return to Oz ditched all of that. It was always likely to struggle in summer blockbuster season. And yet, while it's unquestionably bleak, Return to Oz is magical in its own way. It's not the spectacle of the 1939 movie, but it was never meant to be. It has a DIY aesthetic for sure, but given the state of the Land of Oz at the start of the story, that was kind of the point. You truly believe in what you are watching, even if what you are watching is often completely mental. The film features an amazing central performance from Bulk at such a young age. The score from David Shire is beautiful, and the movie has been acknowledged by some in more recent years as the unique classic that I think it is. The craft required to deliver the whole thing means it remains special on the 40th anniversary of its release. When I was a young culture slice, the Wheelers creeped me out something chronic. Same goes for Princess Mombi and the Hall of Heads, and the Gnome King eating Dorothy's friends, and any number of other freaky moments in this movie. But that was the whole point. Even though I now know that the Wheelers were a group of stunt performers rolling around on all fours and the Gnome King is a claymation masterpiece, a lot of that impact still remains. Murch continued to have a great career, but Return to Oz would be his only work as a director. His monument to the stories he loved so much as a kid. It's a shame we never saw what he might have done next. It was always suited to having a second life on video and later DVD, to be appreciated in a slow burn way rather than the high pressure environment of blockbuster season. Return to Oz was a trailblazer too. Audiences weren't used to drastically different takes on classic stories in the same way in the 1980s. And I'll take this version any day over whatever that Sam Raimi, James Franco effort was in the 2010s. Made at a time when CGI-heavy retreads were becoming almost unwatchable at points. As Murch recently put it when reflecting more than 40 years on, films should be smarter than the people who make them. You can find plenty of negative reviews for Return to Oz, and that's alright. We need art that splits opinion. I love it and always will, but I can appreciate your perspective if you don't. And just like the other movies we're covering tonight, I can kind of see why it wasn't a hit at the time. For our final film tonight, we're investigating one of the strangest, most inventive sci-fi movies of the 1980s. One that, in a fairer world or a different dimension, might have become one of the wildest underdog blockbuster hits of any era. But in the chaotic summer of 1984, it fell by the wayside, even though they actually announced a sequel at the end of the movie. Still, it's always worth remembering, no matter where you go, there you are. In the early 1980s, whether through luck or design, it felt like more unique, sometimes mad creative visions were being given a chance in Hollywood. It didn't always work out, but for a time at least, the door to make something truly original was open. Or at least, slightly ajar. And through that door walked Buckaroo Banzai, an idea that had been developed for years by its writer Earl Mac Rauch and director W.D. Richter. See, I told you he'd be back. The pair had crafted a detailed world and intricate character backstories for the film concept, which combined sci-fi, action, adventure and comedy into something completely different. This was the story of a brain surgeon, a test pilot, a physicist, a rock star, a samurai, an adventurer. all of which happen to be the same person by the name of Buckaroo Banzai. Banzai opens up a pathway to another dimension while testing his device, the oscillation overthruster, which allows him to pass through solid matter via the 8th dimension. With his enemy Dr. Emilio Lizardo hoping to steal the overthruster and red Lectroid aliens from Planet 10 coming to Earth though, Buckaroo must team up with his friends and bandmates to save the world, whilst also finding love along the way. Taking influence from pulp comics of the 1930s, Buckaroo Banzai was a weird, bold and totally one-of-a-kind film. It had big ideas, a singular vision, and that unmistakable 80s sheen. Oh, and it was every bit as crazy as it sounds. It wouldn't end up making money, but it definitely would leave a legacy, if only they could just get the thing made. In the early 80s, Richter and Rauch's passion project looked to be about to go into production at MGM, under producer Neil Canton and studio head David Begelman, who loved the concept. Richter had been nominated for Best Screenplay at the 1981 Oscars, which didn't hurt their prospects. The only problem was, the 1981 Writers Guild strike completely stopped momentum on the project, and Begelman soon left MGM after a series of flops. Undeterred, he created his own production company to make Buckaroo Banzai, and convinced 20th Century Fox to release it. Begelman was already a pretty controversial figure, given his embezzlement scandal at Columbia Pictures a few years earlier. But Buckaroo Banzai was going to get made. It had a decent sized budget, eventually around $17 million, but the scope of the movie was huge. The casting was considered and deliberate. Peter Weller became Buckaroo as someone who could be both heroic and intelligent enough to be a neurosurgeon, while the role of lead villain Lizardo was written with John Lithgow in mind, with Ellen Barkin as love interest Penny Priddy, Lewis Smith amongst the members of Buckaroo's band the Hong Kong Cavaliers, and the likes of Jeff Goldblum and Christopher Lloyd. It featured a who's who of potential future household names, with each character given a specific look and backstory. As Barkin recalls, none of the characters are quite what they should be, just my kind of thing. That quirkiness extended to every element of the movie. The film could be read on multiple different levels, or just enjoyed for its unique visual elements alone. Buckaroo Banzai went into production in the summer of 1983 across Los Angeles, and issues soon followed. Begelman requested constant changes, at least initially, battling with the director and writer. Fox execs, who thought they were getting a sci-fi comedy that could be a Spielberg or Lucas knockoff, didn't understand it. Events like the director of photography being replaced mid-shoot without input from the filmmakers demonstrated the issues. When it came to post-production, at the request of execs, the runtime was considerably cut and entire scenes, like an opening featuring Jamie Lee Curtis as Buckaroo's mother, were removed. One scene that did somehow survive though was an entirely random moment in a science lab with a clamped watermelon, simply added to see if anyone would notice. They didn't, and the watermelon is never explained in the film. In the end, Buckaroo Banzai somewhat fell over the finish line, battered and bruised, and the studio essentially gave it no promotion. The writing was on the wall when it hit cinemas on August 10th, 1984. The summer of '84 was survival of the fittest for any new release, with the likes of Gremlins, Ghostbusters, The Karate Kid, Temple of Doom, The Neverending Story, The Last Starfighter, Romancing the Stone, and yes, The Muppets Take Manhattan, all in cinemas. But for a film which was quite mad to begin with, that had been dumped by its confused studio, Buckaroo Banzai had no chance. Without any momentum, the movie did nothing at the box office. It hit 15th spot in the charts on its opening week, and that was the peak. It would make just over $6.2 million in North America, less than half its production budget, and it would barely get an international release to write home about. For years, I would hear or read about this film Buckaroo Banzai, with a long title about something to do with dimensions. Ellen Barkin was in it, and RoboCop was the lead. It was revered as a classic, but it never seemed to turn up on TV, at least in the UK, so I hunted the thing down eventually. It did not disappoint. Despite the studio meddling, it still held up incredibly well, especially the first half, and it deserves its cult status today. A sequel, Buckaroo Banzai Against the World Crime League, was actually promoted at the end of the movie, but that hasn't yet seen the light of day. I'd say it's unlikely that it ever will. Richter reflected on the lack of a sequel decades later. That seems like a real cheat, to put it there and not make the movie. But again, if the movie had gone on to make a fortune, we would have made it. It remains one of the great Lost sequels. Clearly, there was so much more to explore in the Buckaroo Banzai world. Though it felt like a great Hollywood calling card, Richter's career as a director didn't last long. He returned to screenwriting with the likes of Big Trouble and would only direct one more film, 1991's Late for Dinner. As for Rauch, he wrote another movie, the 1989 John Belushi biopic Wired, before largely disappearing from view. He retained some Buckaroo Banzai rights and even released a follow-up book in 2021. But the Hollywood system on Buckaroo seems to have burned them both out, as Richter reflects. I really don't want to have 5 people in a room giving me notes, and that's the thing that wears you down. To some extent, I can appreciate a marketing team not quite knowing what to do for Buckaroo Banzai in the mid-80s. There was no segmented targeting of audiences across multiple platforms in 1984, just posters and TV and maybe radio, so promotional tools were pretty blunt. What I can't appreciate though is a studio dumping a film as interesting as this and not even giving it a proper marketing campaign. Rolled out on a smaller number of screens by Fox, Buckaroo Banzai never got a chance to become the slow build hit that it could and should have been. The studio was going through internal management changes and Buckaroo fell through the cracks. They had no idea what to do with it, but didn't try anyway. It was too strange and too smart, and apparently Fox never even asked about a sequel, despite it being revealed in the actual movie. Richter is grateful for the film being made, almost despite the Hollywood system in front of them. I just said, I'm going to do it if somebody stops us, and the studio almost did several times, but we just kept going. Normally, Hollywood wouldn't let you make that movie. It's a fluke. Whether fluke or not, it feels like this era of 80s experimentation, before more and more studios were completely gobbled up by major multinational conglomerates, might have been the final time that it could have been made. Buckaroo Banzai was not a blockbuster hit, but in a better world, it should have been. This is the kind of movie we don't get enough of, and despite all the production problems, it still came together in the end. At least we live in a world where Buckaroo Banzai exists, I guess. And for that, we can be thankful. Endings are important, iconic, an undervalued element of a great movie. And I mean that Buckaroo Banzai group strut, it must be one of the greatest in film history, right? Years before Reservoir Dogs 2, only it's at the end, not the start. And the film it's in has just a tad less blood splattered along the way. Anyway, where was I? If there had been a 1985 Oscar for Best End Credits Group Strut, Buckaroo Banzai would have walked it. Pure cinema. Buckaroo Banzai was just pure cinema. But wait, why is there a watermelon there?
I'll tell you later.
In the end, revisiting these 4 films reminded me that Hollywood would once allow more truly wild creative swings for the fences to sneak out of the system. Movies that had no guarantees of success whatsoever, but still made it to the screen. And that's worth celebrating, because when it comes to culture, weird is good, weird is important, and weird fosters genuine progress. And the 1980s gave us plenty of it. Just another thing to love the decade for, I guess. And speaking of the 1980s and the 90s, oh, and a little bit of 2000s, we've just dropped the first episode of a brand new series for channel members called Lost in the Shuffle. Lost in the Shuffle explores long forgotten movies from those golden decades. They're a bit like mini Lost Blockbusters, only the films weren't really aiming to become blockbusters at all. If you think that sounds cool and want to support the channel's growth, get early access to videos and buy me a pint pint at the Blue Oyster Bar, then hit the join button or click the link in this video's description. You can also check out the trailer for Lost in the Shuffle coming up right now. And thank you so much to everyone who has joined Club Slice so far. If you stay until after the trailer, we'll have a bit more of a detailed channel update as well. Roll the tape. If you can see and hear this, then you're still watching this video, so cheers to that. Apart from our new Club Slice series, there's a funhouse of good stuff to come for everyone from across the Culture Slice dimension in the not too distant future. The next main channel release sees the return of Sequel Palooza, with a video about a truly mind-boggling example of sequel-based carnage. As the first movie in this series clearly stated, there should have been only one. At least, I think that's what it said. Lost Comedies is back in October with a spooktacular Halloween-tinged episode covering 4 films for which the scariest part of all was their terrifying box office takings. We're also coming close to the voting deadline for your chance to be part of our special 2-year anniversary chart show ranking all 7 Police Academy movies. So if you have the same kind of love-hate relationship that I do with one of the most 80s film franchises in existence, then click the link of the video in the description below that gives you all the details on how your ranking of the movies can count towards the final result. There's plenty more coming on the main channel and our second channel Culture Slice Cuts, so if you're not subscribed to both, maybe you need to head off to see the wizard. No, not that wizard. And on that note, be good to yourselves, catch you on the flip side, and yes, save Ferris.